cemetery fog. The village of Black Hollow was nestled in a hidden valley, surrounded by ragged hills and old woods. It was a forgotten place, where gas lamps still lit the evenings, and horse-drawn carriages were the primary mode of transportation. The year was 1827, and life in Black Hollow was simple but veiled in mystery. At the center of the village was St. Matthias Cemetery, a vast burial ground spanning centuries. The villagers did not like to visit the cemetery, especially after dark, as it was rumored that a thick, mysterious fog would emanate from the graves, carrying with it the whispers of the dead. Those who were courageous or foolish enough to go close said they heard faint screams and laughter through the mist. Father Edward Hastings arrived in a cold September evening. A young clergyman in late 20s, Edward was dispatched to Black Hollow's very old church. He had a tall and slender face with sharp features, with a softness that indicated an air of calm resolution. The villagers received him cautiously with curiosity and whispered into each other as he passed along. "You're the new priest?" asked an elderly man at the inn, where Edward stopped for supper. His tone was wary, his eyes filled with unspoken warnings. Edward nodded. "Yes, Father Edward Hastings. It's a pleasure to meet you." The old man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Beware the cemetery, Father. It's cursed. Many have tried to uncover its secrets, but none have returned the same." Edward smiled politely and dismissed the comment as local superstition. His faith was strong, and he believed that fear of the unknown could be conquered with God's guidance. Yet as he made his way to the rectory later that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching him from the shadows. The first few days in Black Hollow were uneventful. Edward busied himself with the repair of the neglected church and getting to know the villagers. However, he couldn't ignore the persistent stories about St. Matthias Cemetery. Each account was eerier than the last. "There's a lantern," said Martha, the baker's wife, as she handed Edward a loaf of bread. "An old rusted thing that glows with a pale green light when the fog rolls in. It belonged to a gravedigger named Elias. They say he made a pact with the devil." Edward listened intently, though he still did not believe. That night he knelt in prayer for the strength to face darkness that seemed to grip this village. The fifth night was the night of fog. It started as a thin, silvery mist creeping along the cobblestone streets. By midnight, it had engulfed the entire village, its density unnatural and suffocating. From his room at the rectory, Edward peered out the window, his breath fogging the glass. The cemetery was barely visible, a dark silhouette against the glowing mist. Then he heard it. A faint, haunting melody carried by the wind. It wasn't music. It was more like a series of whispers, rising and falling in a rhythm that made his skin crawl. Gathering his courage, Edward grabbed a lantern and headed out. Edward entered the gates, air that had been growing cold, fog swirling around him in ghostly tendrils. The whispers grew louder now, forming indistinct words that seemed to call his name. For an instant he halted, gripping the crucifix round his neck, before forcing himself forward to push open the squeaking iron gate. Inside, the fog was thicker, clung to the ground like a living thing. The gravestones appeared and disappeared as Edward moved cautiously forward. His lantern cast eerie shadows that danced on the cracked marble surfaces. The mausoleum at the center of the cemetery was old, with its stone facade covered in moss and ivy. The whispers seemed to emanate from within. Edward took a deep breath, approached the door, and then found it ajar. Inside, he found a rusty lantern placed on an ornate pedestal. The glass was cracked, the metal tarnished, but yet it glowed with an otherworldly light that seemed faint. Just when Edward reached out to touch it, the whispers transformed into a deafening roar. "Go out of here!" a voice thundered, shaking the stone under his feet. Edward staggered backward and broke through his lantern onto the stone floor. The lamp burst forth with brightness, as for one moment he could see them. The shapes of the dead, empty sockets turned on him from out the mist. Edward fled the mausoleum, his heart pounding. He returned to the rectory, but sleep eluded him. The next morning, he found the villagers even more withdrawn than before. "You went to the cemetery, didn't you?" Martha asked, her voice trembling. "I did," Edward admitted. "There's something unnatural there, something evil, but I won't let it consume this village." "Many have tried, Father," she said softly, "and they've all failed. Be careful." Edward resolved to uncover the truth no matter the cost. He began researching the cemetery's history, uncovering tales of a gravedigger named Elias Blackwood, who had been accused of witchcraft in 1684. According to legend, Elias had used the lantern to summon spirits, promising them vengeance against those who wronged him. The villagers had burned him alive, but the lantern remained, cursed by his final breath. The deeper Edward explored, the more he discovered that the fog was not just a natural occurrence. It was the manifestation of spirits bound to the lantern. The cemetery was not a resting place. It was a battleground between the living and the dead. Edward knew his faith would be tested like never before. The whispers, the fog, and the lantern were all pieces of a puzzle he had to solve before the spirits consumed Black Hollow entirely. Edward Hastings couldn't forget the night's events. The faces within the fog haunted his sleep, their hollow eyes going through the veil of slumber. Every morning he woke up drenched with sweat, and the whispers remained in his ears. Villagers avoided him now. Fear and pity were visible within their gazes, as if the curse in the cemetery had already started staining him. Determined to get the truth out, Edward spent his days poring over old church records and local accounts in search of some clue that might explain the cemetery's dark history. The more he learned, the deeper the mystery grew. The whispers, the fog, the glowing lantern, all pointed to a darkness that stretched back centuries. Among the dusty records in the archive of the church, a faded journal was found among them, belonging to former priest Father Jonathan Willard, who had served this village during the late 17th century. A journal detailing the trial and execution of Elias Blackwood, a gravedigger accused of practicing witchcraft in 1684, was found. Elias was a strange fellow, one entry read. He spoke to the dead as though they were his kin, and claimed the lantern he carried could pierce the veil between this world and the next. The journal explained how the villagers had become increasingly suspicious of Elias, blaming him for mysterious deaths and disappearances. One stormy night, they dragged him out of his shack near the cemetery, tied him to a post, and set him ablaze. His last words, scribbled hurriedly by Father Willard, sent a chill down Edward's spine. "You will never silence me. I will return with the fog, and the dead shall rise to claim what is theirs." Edward closed the journal, his hands shaking as he did so. For Elias, his curse was a promise, not the maunderings of a dying man. That night, as Edward prepared for his nightly prayers, the fog returned. It seeped through the village streets like a living entity, its density swallowing the light of the gas lamps. Edward lit a fresh lantern and made his way to the cemetery, clutching his Bible tightly. The whispers started before he even reached the gates. This time they were louder, more insistent. Words formed amidst the hissing and murmuring, their meaning chillingly clear. "Join us, Edward. We are waiting." The cemetery was unnervingly still, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Edward felt the weight of unseen eyes on him as he approached the mausoleum. The lantern was still there, glowing faintly on its pedestal. "What do you want from me?" Edward called out, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. The fog shifted, coalescing into vague human shapes. One figure stepped forward, its features barely discernible through the mist. It was a woman, her face twisted in anguish. "Help us," she whispered. "He won't let us rest." "Who?" Edward asked, his voice trembling. "Elias," she replied. "He binds us to this place. Destroy the lantern and we will be free." Edward's heart pounded as he left the cemetery. The apparition's plea echoed in his mind. The only way to end the curse seemed to be destroying the lantern, but he knew it would not be easy. The journal hinted at the unnatural power of the lantern, suggesting that it was more than just an object. It was a vessel for Elias's vengeance. On the next morning, Edward went to the village blacksmith, Thomas Reed, to solicit his help. "I want something powerful, something that can break metal," he said. Thomas furrowed his brow but handed him a heavy sledgehammer. "What are you going to do, Father?" Edward hesitated. "I'm going to put an end to the curse that torments this village." Thomas said nothing, but he crossed himself and paled. Armed with the sledgehammer, Edward returned that night to the cemetery. The fog was thicker still, with whispers louder, more menacing. As he approached the mausoleum, he felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder. Turning around, nothing but fog. Inside the mausoleum, the light of the lantern seemed far brighter. Its beam made eerie shadows on the wall. Edward lifted the sledgehammer, tensing his muscles to deliver a blow. Before he could bring it down, the fog erupted into a swirling vortex, and the mausoleum filled with unearthly shrieks. Figures emerged from the mist, their forms flickering like dying flames. They were the spirits of the dead, their faces contorted in rage. "Leave!" they screamed in unison. "It is not your place!" Edward stumbled backward, dropping the hammer. He clutched his crucifix, praying as the spirits closed in. The lantern's glow intensified, and the spirits recoiled, their forms dissolving into the fog. Edward fled the mausoleum, his heart racing. He returned to the rectory and spent the rest of the night in prayer. The next morning, he confided in Martha. "I saw them," he said. "The spirits. They're bound to the lantern, but they're not evil. They're trapped." Martha nodded solemnly. "Elias's curse is stronger than any of us imagined. You'll need more than faith to break it." Edward knew she was right. To break the lantern, he had to face Elias's full wrath. So he began preparing himself for the final confrontation, with the hope that he could end the curse once and for all. Edward's journey into the heart of the darkness of the cemetery was yet to start. The fog held secrets that would test his faith, courage, and even his sanity. The fog seemed thicker than ever that evening, a tangible wall of white that muffled the world. Edward Hastings stood at the window of the rectory, staring out at the cemetery's ghostly outline. The journal lay open on the desk behind him, its yellowed pages scattered with scrawled warnings from Father Willard. Each line seemed to mock him, daring him to act against the centuries-old curse. Edward clenched his fists. There was nothing else to destroy the lantern to free those souls imprisoned in the cemetery, but he could not forget how angry the spirits were. They had been bound so long that their torment twisted them into something he could not recognize. There was a hard knock at the door, and he spun around to see Martha standing in the doorway, a look of concern and determination on her face. "You can't do this alone," she said, stepping inside. "If Elias's spirit is still tied to the lantern, you'll need someone to watch your back." Edward hesitated. He didn't want to put her in danger, but he also knew she was right. "All right," he said finally, "but we must be prepared for anything." The fog caught them just as they started walking towards the graveyard. It consumed the dying embers of their lanterns. Whispers arose early, a faint mumble that they could barely hear at first, and getting louder with every step taken forward. "Do you hear that?" Martha whispered, so close to a whisper no one would really know that's what she said, unless you listened real close. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, circling them like vultures. Edward tightened his grip on the crucifix in his hand, muttering a prayer under his breath. The iron bars of the cemetery gates loomed ahead, slick with moisture. Beyond them, the mausoleum stood like a dark sentinel, its outline barely visible through the fog. Inside the mausoleum, The lantern's glow was more vivid than ever, casting an eerie green light dancing along the walls. Edward approached it cautiously, his heart pounding. Martha stood behind him, her own lantern trembling in her hands. As Edward reached out to touch the lantern, the air around them grew icy. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the fog inside the mausoleum swirled violently. "Who dares disturb my rest?" The voice thundered through the mausoleum, deep and malignant. Edward turned to see a figure emerging from the fog. It was Elias Blackwood, his ghostly form dressed in the tattered clothes of a gravedigger. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his face was twisted in a cruel smile. "You think you can break my curse?" Elias sneered. "Foolish priest, you cannot undo what was done in blood and fire." Edward held up his crucifix. "Your time has passed, Elias. Release these souls and face the judgment of the Lord." Elias laughed, a hollow sound that sent chills down their spines. "The Lord abandoned me long ago, just as he will abandon you." The lantern's light flared, and the spirits imprisoned in the fog began to materialize. They surrounded Edward and Martha, their faces twisted with pain and rage. Martha screamed as one of the spirits lunged at her, its ghostly hand passing through her chest. She fell to her knees, gasping for air. Edward rushed to her side, praying a prayer of protection. The spirit recoiled, its form dissolving into the fog. Edward helped Martha to her feet, his resolve hardening. "We have to destroy the lantern," he said. "How?" Martha gasped, clutching her chest. "Faith," Edward replied, "and courage." He turned back to the lantern, gripping the sledgehammer tightly. Elias's laughter echoed through the mausoleum as Edward raised the hammer. "You think you can defeat me with that?" Elias taunted. Edward swung the hammer with all his might, but the lantern didn't even flinch. The blow sent a jolt through the mausoleum, and Edward was knocked to the floor. "You cannot break what holds me," Elias said, "not by force." Edward and Martha retreated to the rectory, their defeat heavy in their hearts. Edward spent the next day scouring Father Willard's journal, hoping for any clue that might help them. One entry jumped out at him. "The lantern's power is tied to Elias's final resting place. Only by sanctifying his grave can the curse be broken." Edward's heart sank. Elias's grave had been unmarked, the villagers too afraid to memorialize the man they had condemned. Finding it would be nearly impossible. Martha entered the room, carrying a tray of tea. "Did you find anything?" Edward nodded grimly. "We need to find Elias's grave." That evening, Edward and Martha came back to the cemetery. The fog was denser than ever, and the whispers almost deafening. With shovels and holy water, they set out to find any hint of Elias's resting place. The fog seemed to defy them, warping the terrain into a maze. Time elapsed, and tiredness started to get the better of them. Just as Edward was about to quit, Martha called out, "Over here!" She stood beside a weathered stone, half buried in the earth. Edward brushed away the dirt, revealing a crude inscription, E.B. 1684. "This must be it," he said. As Edward began to dig, the fog thickened, and Elias's voice echoed around them. "You dare disturb my grave?" The ground beneath them trembled, and the spirits emerged once more, their forms more solid than before. Edward continued to dig, his prayers growing louder as the spirits closed in. Martha stood her ground, holding the crucifix high. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice trembling. The spirits hesitated, their forms flickering. Edward dug up a decaying wooden box and flung open the lid, revealing Elias's skeletal remains. He doused the bones with holy water and recited the rites of exorcism. The mausoleum shook violently, and Elias's scream reverberated throughout the cemetery. The spirits dissolved into the fog, their anguish replaced by a sense of peace. The glow of the lantern faded into darkness, and the mist started to clear. The two of them collapsed on the ground, exhausted in body, and relieved in their minds. The curse may be broken, but for Edward, their journey was nowhere near over. The reverberations of the past are there, and the secret of the curse upon Elias was still hidden. The morning after their harrowing experience in the cemetery, Edward Hastings sat in the rectory's study staring at Father Willard's journal. Golden light poured through the window, but it did little to drive away the weight that lay upon Edward's chest. Although Elias's remains had been sanctified and the lantern extinguished, something felt wrong. The air was heavy with unease, and a strange chill lingered in the rectory. Martha entered the room, her face pale and drawn. "I didn't sleep a wink," she admitted. "I kept hearing whispers, and I felt like someone was watching me." Edward looked up sharply. "You heard whispers? Even after the lantern's light faded?" Martha nodded. "Do you think we missed something?" Edward ran his fingers through his hair, frustration gnawing at him. Maybe sanctifying Elias's grave wasn't enough. The curse runs deeper than we understand. Edward and Martha were determined to find answers. They returned to the cemetery that evening. The fog rolled in once more, thicker and more oppressive than before. The whispers were louder too, rising and falling like the mournful wail of a distant choir. As they walked closer to the mausoleum, Edward discovered something which he had not seen prior: strange markings on stone walls. He saw the marks faint, almost erased by time, but they seemed terrible, their silhouette like knives cutting into souls. "They were not there before," Martha whispered, touching one symbol with her index finger. Edward opened Father Willard's journal, looking for any mention of such markings. His stomach dropped when he read on to a passage describing forbidden ritual performed by Elias Blackwood before his death. "Elias didn't just curse the lantern," Edward mumbled. "He bonded his soul, and those of others, to this land via an ancient rite. Destroying the lantern only was the first step." As they examined the mausoleum, the ground beneath them trembled. A low, guttural growl emanated from the shadows, and the air grew colder. "We're not alone," Martha said, clutching Edward's arm. A figure emerged from the fog, its form distorted and shadowy. It wasn't Elias, but something far more monstrous. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its elongated limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally. Edward drew up his crucifix, but the beast did not draw back like the spirits had done before. Instead, it stepped forward, and its growling was turning to laughable sounds. "You cannot undo what has been done," said the creature in a voice that seemed unnatural. "This land belongs to the cursed now." Edward and Martha ran from the mausoleum as the beast laughed at them. Back at the rectory, Edward digested the journal while Martha sought all religious texts she could gather. They had to have a clue as to how Elias had performed the ritual if they were going to be at all hopeful about lifting the curse. Hours passed, and Edward finally found a clue. The ritual's power was drawn from a sacred artifact, he read aloud. Elias used it to anchor his curse to the land. If we can find and destroy the artifact, we might sever his hold on the cemetery. "But where would he have hidden it?" Martha asked. After some moments, Edward said, "It must be somewhere important to Elias, somewhere he thought no one would be stupid enough to look." It turned out that their quest ended in a forgotten section of the cemetery, with all sorts of weeds behind the fog. They reached the old chapel whose roof had caved in, and whose walls covered by moss appeared to them. "This must be it," Edward said, carefully stepping inside. The air reeked of rotting bodies, and the whispers grew louder as they approached the altar. Beneath it, there was a hidden compartment. A small, intricately carved box rested inside. Edward opened it to reveal a strange, blackened relic, a fragment of bone wrapped in cloth with the same symbols they'd seen on the mausoleum. "This has to be the artifact," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. As soon as Edward touched the relic, the ground beneath them shook violently, and the fog inside the chapel coalesced into a towering figure. It was Elias, his form more terrifying than ever. "You dare to defile my sanctuary," he roared, his voice shaking the very walls of the chapel. Edward held the relic aloft. "Your reign of terror ends here, Elias. Your curse will be broken." Elias lunged at them, but Edward started to recite a prayer of exorcism, his voice steady despite his fear. Martha joined in, holding the crucifix tightly. The relic began to glow, its light growing brighter as their prayers intensified. Elias screamed, his form flickering and distorting. "You will pay for this," he bellowed, before vanishing into the fog. The glow of the relic faded, and the fog began to lift. For the first time in centuries, the cemetery felt still. The oppressive weight that had hung over the land was gone, and the whispers had ceased. Edward and Martha returned to the rectory, exhausted but relieved. They knew the battle had been won, but the cost weighed heavily on them. "I think it's over," Martha said softly. Edward nodded. "For now, but we must remain vigilant. Evil has a way of lingering in the shadows." The stillness after Elias's defeat was illusory. Edward Hastings and Martha stood by the window of the rectory, looking out at the cemetery lit up in pale moonlight. The fog had departed, leaving an eerie quiet that hung in the heavy air. Neither felt relief at the destruction of the accursed relic. "There's something wrong," Martha said quietly, her eyes darting between rows of graves. Edward nodded. "I feel it too. It's as if something bigger has been awakened." The relic may have been a conduit for Elias's curse, but destroying it seemed to have unleashed something more ancient, something even Elias himself had tried to contain. Later that night, as Edward prepared for bed, a deafening knock echoed through the rectory. He froze, gripping the edge of the table. "Who can it be at this time of night?" asked Martha, looking through the curtains. Nobody was there, but the knocking was growing louder and more insistent. Edward took a lantern and cautiously opened the door. There stood a frail old woman, wrapped in worn black robes. Her face was pale, her eyes milky white, and her voice barely above a whisper. "You've done a terrible thing," she said, pointing a bony finger at Edward. "Who are you?" Edward demanded. "I am Agatha, the last guardian of the cemetery. Elias's curse was but a thread in a larger tapestry. You've severed one strand, but the others will unravel." Edward's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" Agatha came closer. She was quite unnerving. The relic didn't anchor Elias's soul alone. It was a seal that locked some sort of abomination beneath the cemetery. The seal's broken and the ancient ones stir. Agatha brought them to an area in the cemetery that they had not passed through before. A section choked by thorny vines and old trees. At the middle is a colossal stone slab marked with unrecognizable symbols. "This is the true source of the curse," Agatha said, her voice shaking. "Elias found it centuries ago and tried to tap its power. He succeeded only in binding himself to it." As they approached the slab, the ground began to shake. Cracks spread across its surface, and a low, guttural vibration came from below. "What's happening?" Martha asked, clutching at Edward's arm. Agatha's milky eyes went wide with fear. "Too late. They're waking up." The slab creaked and shifted, revealing a dark, spiraling staircase that led into the earth. Despite their better judgment, Edward and Martha descended, lanterns held high. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls were slick with moisture. At the bottom, they found themselves in a vast underground chamber. The walls were covered with grotesque carvings depicting ancient rituals and monstrous beings. In the center of the room stood an altar, surrounded by pulsating tendrils of fog. "This is where Elias performed his ritual," Edward said, his voice echoing in the cavern. Just before they could examine the altar closer, the fog coalesced into a towering figure. It wasn't Elias, but something far worse. Its form was amorphous, morphing between shapes too grotesque to even fathom. The figure spoke in a voice that seemed to come from all directions. "You dare to disturb our slumber. You mortals are nothing but fleeting shadows in our eternal night." Edward and Martha stood there unmoving as the creature came forward. Agatha had trailed them into the room. She stepped forward. "I have waited my whole life for this moment," she said, grasping a dagger. Before Edward could do anything to stop her, Agatha plunged the dagger into her chest and chanted in an ancient language. Her sacrifice caused the chamber to quake violently, and the creature screamed in rage. "The seal can only be restored with a life," Agatha gasped before collapsing to the ground. Edward and Martha seized the opportunity. They recited prayers while pouring holy water over the altar, using every ounce of faith and strength they had left. The fog recoiled, and the monstrous figure began to dissolve. But the chamber was collapsing around them. Edward grabbed Martha's hand, and together they raced up the spiraling staircase as rocks and debris rained down. As they emerged into the cemetery, the stone slab slid back into place, sealing the horrors below. The ground stopped shaking, and an eerie calm settled over the land. Days passed, and Edward and Martha stood over Agatha's grave, mourning the woman who gave her life to save the world from a monstrosity that defied all human imagination to speak. "She knew this was her fate," Martha said softly. Edward nodded. Her sacrifice ensured that the darkness would remain buried, for now. Though the cemetery was silent, Edward couldn't shake a feeling that the battle hadn't ended yet. Fog may lift and whispers may fade, but evil had the peculiar habit of waiting for another day. "We've done all we can do," he said, reaching over to pat Martha's shoulder. "Let's hope it's enough."